G'day mate, 40 here. So, strength or weakness of this show is that I base much of my world analysis on my own shortcomings. Right? I have the equivalent of numerous personality disorders flowing through me, which have done major damage to the quality of my life. And so when I spot public figures who seem to have similar personality disorders to what I've suffered, right? And if I then can see a consistent through line that's perhaps best summarized by naming it with personality disorder, and this explanation then it seems to have explanatory value, and it seems to have predictive value, and it seems consistent with the through line of their life and career, right? Then I find it useful. So when you had the most successful, profitable hedge fund, right? The one largely operated by Robert Mercer, right? The process of building up that fund was to just get as much data as possible and then put computers to work analyzing that data and then making trades based on the patterns that computers found, even if these patterns were counterintuitive. And so that's similar to how I analyze world events, politics. So, example number one. You will be thrilled to know that Vox Day is on Substack. My God, what a giant leap forward for intellectual discourse. Mr. Day is on Substack. And in one of his recent Substack posts, he notes that the overwhelming majority of women treat men with contempt and disdain, and they belittle men, put them down, and they speak to men and treat men in a way that if another man did that, right, he'd get punched in the face. And I think there's a grain of truth to what Vox Day says, but I think overall, overwhelmingly, that observation says far more about Vox Day than it does about male-female relations. So I resonate with his observation because it's been true of much of how I've experienced life, right? I grew up in foster care. I lived with about a dozen different families between age 1 and age 4 due to my mother was dying of cancer. And then there were other challenges in my childhood where I was bounced off the walls and smacked around quite a bit. And I overwhelmingly received a feminist education, right? Overwhelmingly, my teachers were female, at least in primary school. And I grew up in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is a very feminine, nurturing environment that severely frowns on competition. And so I felt enraged at women as a result of this. It wasn't the only thing I felt about women. I also felt awe. I also felt love. I also felt affection. Right? I had many feelings, but there was a through line of hatred of women in my psyche that came out of my early childhood experiences. So there was a psychiatrist, I believe his name was Dr. Money, perhaps Robert Money, who says we all have a love map, right? We all have an erotic template in our head, which creates tremendous attraction for us, and it largely comes out of events in the first 5 years of our life. And so in the first 5 years of my life, I just frequently felt frustrated and demeaned and abused by women. And so I developed a love map that's not very nice. It's not very loving. My love map is not loving. My love map is filled with rage and anger at women. And Now, it doesn't display in all relationships. So I've had very sweet, loving girlfriends with whom I had very sweet, loving relationships. And that element of anger and hatred was quite muted, right? Very little of it came out. On the other hand, I've had at least one girlfriend who was highly disdainful and contemptuous of me. And as a result, she triggered those same feelings in me. And I had one girlfriend who was quite aware of the common phenomenon of men fearing and hating women, because she was the daughter of the pornographer Suze Randall. So when she was a girl, she'd come out in the garden and there was Randy West masturbating. And so when I was dating Holly, she'd scream at me, "F me like a whore, take out all your hatred against women on me in bed." And so me, who frequently felt powerless in life, right, in the bedroom, wanted to play to the polarity of being all powerful, while Holly, who had considerable power in real life, wanted to play to the polarity of being powerless. And noticed this with a lot of women I dated who were powerful in real life, but they wanted me to make every decision with regard to dating and love, romance, courtship, so that they could just relapse into their more female submissive self that they did not get to display much in real life. And this fear and hatred of women that I noticed in myself, it caused me some concern. And by 2007, 2008, I was becoming increasingly aware of love addiction. And by 2011, I started 12-stepping for this disabling, compulsive addiction that I had going on in my relationships, which contained a considerable element of misogyny and fear and hatred of women. And I realized I needed to get help, and that it was diminishing the quality of my life, not to mention the quality of other people's lives. Because if you have any kind of addiction operating in your life, right, you're going to just have a default mode of using and abusing everyone in your life to take care of your addictive needs. So that Vox Day, and he's in his 40s, is he nearly 50, that he thinks that most women treat men with contempt, disdain. I don't think that says much about reality. Right? I think the percentage of women who treat men like that is about the same as the percentage of men who treat women like that. So probably a quarter of women, quarter of men. But that he perceives that as the dominant female reaction makes me suspect that the through line with his life is considerable rage at women, and not just at women, at America, for not recognizing how he is a superior man. So many of us, including yours truly, we devote considerable time and resources to developing a second life online, where we can become the kind of superior man that we feel is denied us in real life. And that makes sense of so much of Vox Day's writing and podcasting. It's this rage at women, rage at society, rage at the West, rage at the elites, rage at the media for not recognizing him as a superior man. And you see the same thing in almost every dissident, right? It's the maladaptive, pathological element in so much of dissident commentary. It's this rage that I've been overlooked, and that just shows what a sucky country America is, and that just shows how women suck, that they don't recognize me as a superior man. So I think this would apply to Richard Spencer, to Nick Fuentes, to Vox Day, to most dissident right-wing commentators in particular. I just don't know the left very well. Have I ever seen the musical Cats? Nope. What sports did I play in high school? I didn't play any on a team, but I just recreationally played touch football, tennis, golf. I was not a theater kid in high school. This marine layer is brutal. It's beautiful, bro. Right? That Anna Uden, psychologist, she says we have to use setbacks and things we don't like and humiliation as a way to reveal what is good and to make us appreciate that which is good. So take the marine layer and use it to appreciate the beauty of sunshine. Women don't respect men who play video games. Very few cars on the streets of Pico Robertson. Oh, we are not on the streets of Pico Robertson, bro. We are near UCLA, Westwood. So what do you think? Am I right? Probably much of dissident commentary, particularly on the right, because that's what I'm familiar with. I don't really follow the dissident left. Much of dissident commentary gets its energy, is providing solace for deep pains about not being recognized by the current power structure and not being recognized in particular by attractive members of the opposite sex. And so that's why there is so much misogyny, misanthropy, loathing of the elites. It's largely a reflection of one's rage at one's own impotence. All right, you're not able to stick it in. Right? You're not able to navigate reality in a way that connects you with the people that you want to be connected with. You are not receiving the applause that you believe you deserve. You are not successful in the real world. Right? You are not successful in the current power structure. And this provides the energy to lash out of the power structure. And remember how easy it is to tap into resentments of people who have more power than you. And that doesn't mean that criticisms of people who have more power than you do, criticisms of the elites, are always wrong. It just recognizes that we all pretty much have a knee-jerk, very sympathetic attitude towards critiquing those who have more power than we do. And in particular, I think I experienced this, particularly in my teens and 20s. I was just outraged by women who seemed to have more power than I did. They felt entitled to just ask for a piece of gum. If I was chewing gum, they were so entitled, those bitches. They just asked for a piece of my gum and they wouldn't give me anything in return. What would it really cost them to allow me, a little access? Right? It'd be no skin off their nose. And yet they denied me. And I was a superior man. Why didn't the world recognize that? Why didn't the hot chicks recognize that? And so, as I even talk about it, I'm in touch with the fury that I developed from the sense that I was not being appropriately recognized for my brilliance in the real world. And so that's what's fueled so much of my fantasy life, which then gets transmitted into my online life. So, what do you think of this theory? What do you think of Box Day's idea that most women display contempt for men? That's not my experience, right? That's a minority of females, just as it's a minority of men who have an overwhelming fear and hatred of women, right? So it's basically men and women without secure attachment. But asking, how is this commentary, online activity, this essay writing, speech, right? How is it serving the compulsive psychological needs of the person who's giving it, right? Is this commentary a way of aggrandizing oneself, justifying oneself, soothing one's insecurity? And if that fits, if it has explanatory and predictive value and fits with the through line of a person's public life as expressed online, then then I think you can largely discount what is produced by those incredibly petty drives. And you particularly see this with creators who place great emphasis on their metrics. Well, I had 2,000 people watching me yesterday, or for many creators, such as who were those blokes behind Trigonometry podcast, the main bloke, right? He felt like his life was justified because a mediocre talk he gave at the Oxford Union received over 1 million views, and he felt like it justified his life, his approach to life, to his wife, to himself, to the universe, because he got 1 million plus views for a completely mediocre speech. Vox lives in Italy. Yeah, because America doesn't properly appreciate him, and he's probably got some financial problems here. Should expats be allowed to comment on the politics of the country they left? Of course. Of course, you often will see things more clearly once you leave. Right? You'll often see the religion that you left more clearly once you leave, or the romantic partner that you left, or the country, the city. Yeah, there are valuable insights to be learned from expats. So I could allow these two live viewers that I have right now to just go to my head, attempt to stay grounded, and see if I can produce some commentary that transcends just the raw, brutal meeting of my base psychological needs, insecurities, and disorders. That's my analysis of people who needlessly hate on groups, including women, or on a great, powerful country that provides unprecedented levels of freedom and prosperity, such as the United States or Australia. Right? Just gratuitously hating on these things, to me, particularly if it's coming from a dissident right-wing perspective, just bespeaks an inner agony that does not enable one to transcend a necessity of providing solace for one's own turbulence. Right? So if you have disabling amount of anxiety in a turbulence, right, by definition, if it's disabling, you're not going to be able to transcend it. And so if people are just repetitively producing commentary that's coming from that place of lack, then it's not particularly useful, and you can spot it a mile away. And you see this with Dennis Prager and a lot of talk radio people, right? They will love to talk about how Prager University has 8 billion views, as though that proves that it has merit. And I think much of Prager University's production does have merit, but most of those views are bought. So when you could track day by day views on Prager University, you'd spot that they'd release a video and initially you'd get 100,000 views for each of the first 4 days. Then it suddenly drops to 100 views. So how does a video go from 100,000, 100,000, 100,000, 100,000 to 83 views in a day? Because for a few days they were buying views by making the video autoplay in their ads, and then when they quit buying the views, all right, the views plunge. So you too could start a YouTube channel that gets 8 billion views, and that doesn't mean you have anything important to say. Right? If you have the same budget at Prager University and the same expertise with buying views, you too could achieve the same results. And it says nothing about the merit of what you're producing. These kids today, they don't know how hard life was in my time, says Elliot. did not sleep well last night. So, are you watching Bad Monkey? It's on Apple Plus. It's based on a Carl Hiaasen novel, and he's just fun and funny novelist. Coming from a lefty perspective, but tremendously amusing. And the wife of the bad guy in Bad Monkey says to the daughter, right, her stepdaughter, right, you may share your dad's DNA, but I swallow his DNA. And it's true. When men can find a woman who swallows his DNA, right, that woman will become the most important person in the world to him. That's why women fear men cheating, because they instinctively know that men will provide and protect and put the priority on the ones who are swallowing their DNA, even more than the ones who share their DNA. So I was just letting Carl Hiaasen novel play all night. Finally gave up, got up at about 3 a.m., had a rare cup of coffee, and perhaps that's why I'm just filled with succulent thoughts. So remember the Cold War that we had with the Soviet Union? And imagine how Americans would react if during the Cold War we had with the Soviet Union, thousands of military-age Soviet men were illegally entering the United States. We'd be outraged. But currently, we have thousands of military-age Chinese men illegally entering the United States, and it gets no attention. So I was just reading an analysis of the foreign policy portion of the Tuesday night debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And these two international relations experts thought that Donald Trump more than held his own with regard to foreign policy. And they both said that judging by results, Donald Trump's term in office was a foreign policy success. And the Biden team, up until his disastrous debate June 27th with Donald Trump, leaked less than any other White House in memory, right? Donald Trump was surrounded by long-term loyalists, and they have long given the impression of a smooth, sophisticated, well-oiled, well-run political machine, but all the while giving the impression of a competent, well-run machine. They've gotten us into absolute disaster in Europe, in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and with China. Right, with China in particular, they talk really tough, but don't back it up. So Donald Trump had a massive increase in military spending during his time in office, right? And Joe Biden has cut way back on that. So Biden, in many ways, has talked tougher with regard to China than Donald Trump, but has done less in terms of building up our military and building up Taiwan. And during Donald Trump's time in office, right, his foreign policy seemed childish and chaotic, while Joe Biden's foreign policy has seemed smooth and pleasing to liberal, humane sensibilities. But the upshot of Biden's foreign policy of just being disaster after disaster, or the upshot of Donald Trump's chaotic, seemingly childish, wretched foreign policy is being excellent. So sometimes people can have a messy desk and a messy life and consistently produce great results. And you can have people who are mean and nasty and volatile, who are highly ethical people. On the other hand, you can have people who are smooth, charming, pious, sophisticated, who produce results that are just chaotic and mediocre. So we have thousands of military-aged Chinese men entering this country illegally, and it gets almost no attention. Right? Donald Trump was right to raise the possibility of some kind of nuclear conflagration due to our over-involvement in Europe and supporting Ukraine. And so it's interesting that Donald Trump wants to end the war in Ukraine without caring about Ukraine achieving victory. And on the other hand, he wants to free up Israel to achieve victory against Hamas. And so why do the Biden administration and the potential Trump foreign policy, why do they come down on opposite sides of the Ukraine-Russia conflict and the Israel and its enemies conflict? And I think Trump rightly judges that Ukraine cannot win vis-a-vis Russia, while Israel can win vis-a-vis Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran. And Biden talks much more in humanitarian terms with regard to foreign policy. Trump talks much more in selfish nationalist terms. And ironically, Trump's selfish nationalist perspective would result in far less suffering, because if Israel crushes Hamas and crushes Hezbollah, right, and crushes Iran, Israel is capable of doing that, and it would result in far less suffering, because you'd have a decisive winner. Ukraine cannot decisively win against Russia, and it'd be madness to try to subsidize Ukraine into doing so. So the US doesn't have to subsidize Israel for Israel to win. Right? Israel is perfectly capable of funding its own procurement of weapons and just simply allowing Israel to buy the weapons that it needs and stop regulating and limiting Israel. So the Biden administration has consistently micromanaged the Ukraine war and the Israel war. And by doing so, they have made the situation a lot worse. Right? There are some fights you don't want to micromanage. You just want to let them blast so that you more quickly get to a conclusion. How do these Chinese men get in through Mexico? Yeah. And also a lot of them overstay their visas. Right? You would have thought that after 9/11 we'd place much more emphasis on limiting immigration from those groups who are most likely to commit terror and sabotage against us. Yeah, I noticed there's just absolutely no connection between sounding competent and being competent, sounding excellent and being excellent, sounding ethical and being ethical. No connection whatsoever. Right? There's substance and there's appearance. And Kamala Harris is pretty good at memorizing talking points. And Donald Trump is not good, but he's still touched on visceral issues with regard to American safety that are more in touch with reality than what Kamala Harris was talking about. I am spending more and more time on Substack these days, right, and less time on the mainstream media. There's just so much good stuff on Substack. Right, perspectives that you don't get in the more hygienic mainstream media. So I want to devote more shows into exploring some of the things I read on Substack. But the points that I'm reading on Substack are more sophisticated than a lot of the mainstream media commentary. And so I'm going to have to do more work to be able to share these more sophisticated ideas and develop commentary on them, as opposed to kind of the 8th grade level of most mainstream news. Right? If you're a producer for NBC News, or an editor or journalist at the Washington Post, you're usually creating content that can be understood by people who can only read on an 8th grade level. But on Substack, and that is much more sophisticated analysis. Is the permissive attitude towards immigration simply a plan to boost real estate values? Right. Our immigration mess seems to be much more a lack of competence than some dastardly plan. Right. It seems to be much more a lack of competence than some sinister conspiracy. Oh, so have you heard of the book The Power Broker by Robert Caro about longtime New York City Parks Commissioner Robert Moses? It's just absolutely magnificent book, and there's an entire podcast that's devoted to it. And they even bring in celebrities to comment on The Power Broker. And one of the blokes they brought in was Conan O'Brien, the former late-night TV comedy host. They also brought in Brandy Zadrozny, the NBC News investigative reporter, tends to target misinformation and conspiracy theorists. And they raised a great question in their conversation with Brandy Zadrozny. Like, who would be the Robert Moses of today? Like, who is incredibly powerful behind the scenes? So Robert Moses, on the face of it, was just a parks commissioner, yet he was the most consequential player in New York City for close to 4 decades, from the 1930 until the late 1960s. And he was really effective at wielding power. And Joe Biden has shown incredible effectiveness in terms of passing legislation and in terms of enlisting allies to support Ukraine. So Joe Biden has passed more consequential legislation than anyone since Reagan. Now, I don't like the upshot of much of his legislation, but I have to give him props in the sense of wielding political power. And I have to give him props that his administration has leaked less than any other administration in decades, and that give him props for having the appearance of a well-run, smooth machine. But given the utter catastrophe of his foreign policy and the flaws with huge boost in inflation with his domestic policy, right, Joe Biden is certainly not a modern-day Robert Moses. Also considering he's non-compos mentis much of the time. And then Donald Trump is no Robert Moses in that he doesn't seem to be particularly skilled at running things. So when I think of major political leaders today who would be the equivalent of Robert Moses, the closest one that I can think of is Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin has done more with less than any other major country politician who I can think of in the past 3 decades. So he took over Russia when it was on the verge of collapse, and he has restored it to the ranks of the great powers. So Vladimir Putin seems to be quite skillful at wielding power. Now, that doesn't mean I approve of how he wields power, doesn't mean I like him, doesn't mean I think he's a great guy. I'm just saying, just as I don't particularly care for Robert Moses and much of what he did, I have to admit that Robert Moses was incredibly good at wielding power behind the scenes. And Vladimir Putin has been incredibly effective at wielding power behind the scenes. And dozens of people, many of whom are incredibly rich and powerful, went up against Robert Moses during his 3 decades in power, and all of them got defeated and humiliated. So when you're up against someone who knows how to wield power, what's the best strategy? Probably don't do it. Okay, did you guys check out Deep Left Jokel and Alex Kashuta's podcast? I have not. It's not even high on my list of priorities. There was one amazing line a day and a half ago. So Wednesday afternoon on Mark Halperin's show, where a Trump supporter said, Trump embarrassment syndrome is a luxury belief by those who don't have a migrant camp on their front yard. And he was responding to that old white woman in Springtown, Ohio, complaining about Haitian migrant camps on her front yard and how that these Haitian immigrants have protected status. And she asked, who's protecting me and my husband? Right, we're going to have to move. No one's protecting us. But I think that was just such a great line. Trump embarrassment syndrome is a luxury belief of those who don't have a migrant camp on their front yard. Right? If your quality of life is being ruined by groups that Donald Trump is willing to target, and no one else is willing to target these groups that are ruining your life, then you're likely to vote for Donald Trump, even if you don't like him, don't care for his rhetoric. And great analysis on Substack, which is just superior to pretty much everything I've read in the mainstream media. And it's such a commonsensical point of view that embarrasses me a little bit that I didn't think of it. Donald Trump has been in public life for 10 years, right? He's, as a politician, right? He's a known quantity. And I share this, all right? I have been blogging since July 3, 1997, right? So for people who know me, right, there's pretty much nothing that I can say or do that will be shocking. And the reason that I've said so many things that are shocking is that I've been seeking, like many other dissident commentators, for a USP, unique selling proposition. And what dissident commentators, right, people who want to be pundits and comment and describe the world around them, but are not employed by the mainstream media, right, one common unique selling proposition that we tend to is to have less restraint and less inhibition than people who have more power than us. So if you are privileged to have a job writing for the New York Times or the New Yorker, you're going to be very careful in what you say because you've got a lot to lose. And as a result of this inhibiting, as a result of this careful speech, right, as a result of this reflexive self-discipline that you exercise over the use of your words, right? You're going to miss out on many obvious parts of life that are embarrassing to describe bluntly. And so the unique selling proposition of people who've developed a following commenting on the news outside of a perch in the mainstream media is that they have less inhibition, right? They will use language that is more raw, more embarrassing, more blunt, more transgressive, that they will put less of a filter between their impulses and what they express publicly. And that's certainly true of me. I mean, how am I going to outcompete Charles Krauthammer, George Will, New York Times, Reason Magazine? And one way that I've consciously and unconsciously tried to do this is to reduce my inhibitions with what I say publicly, to reduce my use of discretion and careful strategy for maintaining my social position with regard to describing what I see in the world around me. And so, as a result of being less inhibited, more spontaneous than people in the mainstream media, I have said a lot of ugly things, said a lot of true things that are also ugly, true things that are embarrassing. I've said things that are more revelative of my own psyche than that which I'm attempting to describe. So I've been all over the map. But this conscious and unconscious unique selling proposition strategy that if I don't have a job in the mainstream media to protect, if I don't have a high status position in society to protect, I should use the advantage of that, the increased freedom that that allows, to reduce my inhibitions and fear of social sanction, to just describe in sometimes brutal and embarrassing fashion the reality of the world around me. And so I can't produce the cultured, erudite, sophisticated prose of George Will or Charles Krauthammer, but I can touch on more basic, primal, brutal, ugly truths that they will want to avoid for fear of losing status, friends, income, and a perch in the mainstream media. I refer to Biden as if he's sole decision maker rather than acknowledging his administration. Shorthand. So often people will say things as a shorthand for a more complicated reality, right? The world is, far more complicated than we can understand and describe. So we will say Biden as a shorthand for the Biden administration. And also, I think that the Biden administration is, by and large, a reflection of Joe Biden. Right? Joe Biden has been in public life since about 1970, when he was elected to the U.S. Senate, representing Delaware. Delaware is an incredibly small state, so a mediocre politician such as Joe Biden would have a much easier time getting elected to the United States Senate from Delaware than a higher population state, such as California or Texas or Pennsylvania or Florida or New York. So one very petty way of critiquing other people's critiques is to note that they're overly simplifying, but it's really hard to talk about anything without simplifying and using shortcuts. So I think this is why people tune into live streams and to commentators outside the mainstream media for a more realistic, less inhibited, more spontaneous description of life that is not so hygienic